A single dad's life changed forever when two little girls knocked at his door. Heart-touching family story. Rain drummed softly against the windows as David leaned over the kitchen table, his pen circling math problems for Leo, his 7-year-old son, who sat yawning beside a cup of half-finished cocoa. The small house smelled faintly of soup, the kind of quiet warmth David had built since his wife's passing 3 years ago. The night felt calm, almost sacred, until a sudden fragile knock echoed from the front door, so light it might have been the wind. David looked up, puzzled, exchanging a glance with Leo. Another knock came, quicker this time, like tiny fists desperate for help. He rose slowly, a flicker of unease crawling up his spine, and crossed the creaking floorboards. When he opened the door, the world outside was swallowed by rain, and in its grey blur stood two little girls, identical in every detail except the fear in their eyes. Their clothes were soaked, their hair clung to their cheeks, and their small hands shivered as they clutched each other. David blinked, unsure if he was seeing ghosts. One of them, her lips trembling, lifted her chin just enough to speak, her voice cracking like a broken whisper. They beaten our mama. She's dying." The words hit him like thunder, slicing through the gentle rhythm of the rain. For a heartbeat, he couldn't move. His breath caught, his chest tightened, and Leo's soft voice from behind, "Dad, who is it?" barely reached his ears. David dropped to his knees, lowering himself to the girl's level, trying to meet their eyes through the trembling and tears. Hey, it's okay," he said quietly, though he didn't believe it himself. One of the twins reached out, clutching his sleeve with icy fingers, her nails dirt-stained, her tiny body shaking from cold and fear. He could smell the wet earth on their clothes and see bruises on the edge of one's wrist. Without a second thought, he grabbed his coat from the hanger, tossing it around their shoulders, trying to warm them. "Where's your mama?" he asked, his voice calm but urgent. The smaller twin pointed toward the street, her hand barely steady. "Back there. She's not moving." The rain grew heavier, as if the sky itself was mourning. David turned to Leo, who now stood at the hallway edge, wide-eyed and frightened. "Stay here, buddy. Lock the door after me." Leo wanted to protest, but something in his father's tone stopped him. David stepped outside, the cold hitting him like a wave, mud splashing under his shoes as he followed the girls through the darkness. They clung to him on either side, their tiny fingers gripping his hands with desperate strength, as though he was their last hope. The streetlight flickered overhead, casting long, distorted shadows on the wet pavement. Every few steps, one of the girls sobbed, but they didn't stop walking. David's mind raced. Questions, fear, adrenaline all colliding, but he forced himself to stay calm. The rain blurred his vision, but he could sense the urgency in the girl's pace. Somewhere inside, the father in him took over completely. He wasn't thinking about who they were or how they got there, only that someone's mother might be dying in the cold. He glanced down at them, their faces pale and glistening, and felt a fierce protectiveness surge within him. "We'll find her," he whispered, almost to himself, his voice swallowed by the storm. The girls didn't answer, but one looked up at him with eyes so full of trust it broke him a little. He squeezed their hands gently, guiding them through the rain-soaked night, unaware that this single knock, the one that shattered the silence, was about to change everything he thought he knew about love, pain, and the family he thought was already complete. The rain fell harder as David followed the trembling twins down the narrow street, their small feet splashing through puddles as they turned sharply behind an old convenience store whose flickering sign buzzed weakly against the night. The alley smelled of rust, trash, and something far worse: fear. His breath quickened when the older twin pointed ahead, her voice breaking. "Mama! There!" Under the dim glow of a distant streetlight, he saw her, a woman lying motionless on the cold ground, her thin body curled beneath a torn, filthy blanket that barely covered her legs. David's heart lurched. She looked fragile, almost ghostly, her skin pale against the dark concrete. Kneeling beside her, he could hear faint, shallow breaths struggling through her lips, and streaks of blood marked her face. He reached out, brushing her damp hair aside, whispering softly, "Mom, can you hear me?" There was no answer, only the sound of rain drumming against metal cans nearby. The twins stood close, clutching each other, sobbing softly as lightning illuminated the alley for a split second. David pulled off his jacket and wrapped it around the woman, his fingers trembling as he searched for a pulse at her wrist. It was weak, barely there, but alive. "Hang on," he muttered, voice tight with urgency. Scooping her into his arms, he felt how cold and light she was, like she had already begun to fade. The twins followed silently, their tiny hands gripping his coat as he hurried toward the main road. His shoes splashed through puddles, breath visible in the mist, heart pounding so loudly he could hear nothing else. When he reached his truck, he opened the back door and gently laid her across the seat, wrapping the blanket tighter around her. The twins climbed in beside her, one resting her head on the woman's chest, whispering, "Mama, please wake up." David's throat tightened as he started the engine. Nay, the headlights cutting through the rain-soaked darkness. Every red light felt like a cruel delay, every second an eternity. He kept glancing in the rearview mirror, watching the girls press their small hands against their mother's arm, whispering prayers he couldn't hear. "Hold on," he said to the woman, as if his voice could anchor her to life. The hospital's bright sign finally appeared through the downpour, and David didn't even park properly. He just stopped, scooped her up again, and rushed through the sliding doors. "Help! She's not breathing right!" he shouted, his voice echoing through the sterile lobby. Nurses sprang into motion, rolling a stretcher toward him as doctors shouted instructions. He placed her down gently, his arms shaking from exhaustion and adrenaline. The twins cried out as a nurse held them back while the medical team surrounded the woman, their voices a blur of medical terms and urgency. David stood frozen, soaked and speechless, watching as they disappeared through the emergency doors. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. The twins clung to his legs, silent now, their eyes wide with confusion and terror. When the doctor finally emerged, David's stomach knotted. "She's in critical condition," the doctor said quietly, his tone heavy. "But she's fighting." That single word, fighting, felt like a fragile lifeline. David exhaled shakily, kneeling to the twins' level. "Your mama's very strong," he told them softly, brushing wet hair from their faces. They nodded, but tears continued to stream down their cheeks. He led them to a quiet bench near the hallway, wrapping his arms around both as they huddled against him, trembling with exhaustion and fear. The hospital buzzed around them, machines beeping, footsteps echoing. But to David, the world had narrowed to these two small girls and the woman fighting for her life behind a closed door. He didn't know her name, didn't know her story, but something deep inside him stirred. A pull he couldn't explain, a quiet sense that fate had placed him here for a reason. As the night deepened, the twins fell asleep against his chest, their tiny hands still clutching his shirt, as if afraid he'd disappear too. David leaned back against the wall, eyes fixed on the glowing red emergency sign above the door. He had come out tonight as a stranger, a man living a quiet life with his son, but now something irreversible had begun. The woman in that room, broken yet breathing, had drawn him into a world he didn't choose but somehow belonged to. As the rain eased outside and the first faint light of dawn touched the windows, David's gaze softened. He whispered a silent promise to no one in particular, his voice low but certain. "You're not alone anymore." The soft beeping of the hospital monitors had become a familiar rhythm to David, a sound that marked both fear and hope. He sat by the bedside, the twins asleep on two chairs pushed together, their tiny hands still clinging to each other even in dreams. It had been 4 long days since that stormy night, 4 days of silent prayers and endless waiting. Then, as the morning light filtered gently through the blinds, a faint movement stirred beneath the blanket. David leaned forward, heart pounding, as the woman's eyelids fluttered open. Her eyes, pale and distant, blinked uncertainly against the light before finding his face. For a moment, confusion clouded her expression, then pain, and finally tears welled up as she whispered, her voice dry and broken, "My girls, are they safe?" David nodded immediately, relief washing over him. "They're safe. They're right here." He reached over and gently touched her shoulder, careful not to disturb the IV lines. The woman's lips trembled as she turned her head slightly, her gaze falling on the twins curled up beside each other. She exhaled a shaky breath, a sound halfway between a sob and a sigh. "Please," she whispered, the word barely escaping her throat. "Please take care of my girls. I have nowhere to go." Her vulnerability pierced through David like a blade of truth. He didn't hesitate. He didn't need to think. "I promise," he said softly, the words steady and full. "I'll take care of them until you heal." A single tear slipped down her cheek, and she closed her eyes again, exhausted but at peace for the first time. In the days that followed, the hospital became their strange new world. David came every morning after dropping Leo at school, bringing warm soup or fresh fruit, things that reminded Emma, he had learned her name now, that kindness still existed. Emma's recovery was slow, her bruises fading into pale marks, her voice growing stronger each day. Sometimes she would thank him, her eyes shining with quiet gratitude. Other times she would stare out the window in silence, lost in thoughts she never shared. The twins, Lily and Lucy, grew fond of David quickly. They waited eagerly for him each morning, running down the corridor shouting, "Uncle David!" Their laughter filled the sterile hallways, making even the nurses smile. When the doctors finally discharged Emma, she had nowhere to return to, and David didn't let her worry. "You'll stay with us," he said simply, as if it was the most natural thing in the world. And so she did. David's house, once a quiet refuge for two, slowly transformed. The sound of Leo's laughter mingled with the giggles of Lily and Lucy, and the air filled with the scent of pancakes, crayons, and bedtime stories. Emma helped around the kitchen when she was strong enough, often insisting despite David's protests. "I need to do something," she would say softly, her eyes warm but still haunted by the past. Sometimes David caught her watching her daughters play, a faint smile touching her lips before fading into something heavier, something like guilt. He never asked, though. He just listened when she was ready to talk. At night, when the children were asleep, they often sat at the small table with tea, speaking in low voices. She told him bits of her story, how life had crumbled, how she had once dreamed of safety, how everything she had was taken by someone who called it love. David didn't interrupt. He simply listened, his quiet presence enough to make her voice steadier. There were nights when silence said more than words. On those nights, she would look at him with a mix of gratitude and disbelief, as if she couldn't understand why someone would care without asking for anything in return. Weeks turned into a rhythm of healing. The girls painted drawings for Uncle David, taping them to the fridge with crooked smiles and hearts. Leo shared his toys without complaint, his easy friendship bridging the gaps between strangers. Emma began to smile more freely, her eyes softer, her laughter no longer a rare sound. One evening she watched David reading to the children, his voice calm and patient, and something inside her shifted, a fragile warmth spreading through the spaces that used to hurt. She realized that her healing wasn't just in the fading bruises or the steady breath she now took without pain. It was in the kindness that filled the walls around her, in the small moments of belonging she had never dared to hope for. David noticed it too. The way the house felt alive again. The way Emma's quiet hums filled the kitchen as she cooked. The way the children's laughter echoed like music. He didn't say it aloud, but he knew something inside him was changing as well. He had opened his door to strangers that night. But what had entered wasn't just need. It was life, fragile, yet beautiful. Emma, once a shadow of pain, now carried light in her eyes, and every time she smiled at her daughters or thanked him for something small, David felt that unspoken connection grow deeper, steadier. By the time spring brushed color back into the world outside, Emma could walk without pain, laugh without fear, and sleep without trembling. The house had become a home for all of them, a place stitched together by shared pain and quiet care. One evening, as the golden light streamed through the window, David saw her standing in the backyard, watching the children play. For a long moment, she looked peaceful, like someone who had finally found a place to rest. And though she said nothing, he knew. She wasn't just healing. She was beginning again. The evening air was calm, the kind of quiet that comes after a long day, filled with laughter and warmth. The children had just gone to bed, their soft giggles fading behind closed doors as David stepped onto the porch with a mug of coffee, watching the faint orange hues disappear beyond the trees. Inside, Emma was folding laundry, her movements gentle, her face peaceful under the warm glow of the living room lamp. For the first time in months, everything felt normal, safe even. But safety, David was about to learn, can vanish as quickly as it arrives. A sudden harsh knock shattered the stillness, not like the timid one from that stormy night, but loud, demanding, angry. David's heart tightened instantly. He set down his mug and opened the door cautiously, and there he was. A tall, broad man with unshaven cheeks, eyes bloodshot, and the unmistakable stench of alcohol spilling from his breath. His posture swayed slightly, his face twisted in rage. "Where is she?" the man growled, his voice slurred but sharp. "Where's Emma?" David's instinct flared. He stepped forward, blocking the doorway, his tone calm but firm. "You need to leave." The man laughed bitterly, pushing his finger into David's chest. "She's mine. You can't take my girls away from me." His words came out like venom, loud enough that Emma, folding clothes in the next room, froze. Her blood ran cold at the voice she hadn't heard in months, the voice that had haunted her dreams and bruised her soul. The laundry slipped from her hands as he stumbled toward the door, her body trembling. When her eyes met his, all the color drained from her face. The twins, awakened by the shouting, peered nervously from the hallway, clutching each other's hands. "Get away from him, Emma," David ordered, stepping further between them. The man's rage ignited, his fists clenching. "You think you can steal what's mine?" he shouted, taking a step forward. The smell of whiskey hit David's nose, and he knew this confrontation wasn't just anger. It was years of cruelty boiling over. David's voice hardened. "You lost the right to call them yours when you hurt them." The man roared, shoving at David's shoulder, but David didn't move. His years of quiet strength, of raising Leo alone, had taught him resilience beyond words. "You're not welcome here," David said again, his tone like stone. "Leave before you regret it." The man's fury grew wild. He lunged toward the doorway, shouting Emma's name, his face twisted with hate. Emma screamed, backing away, and the twins began to cry, their small voices cutting through the chaos like knives. David reacted instantly, grabbing his phone and dialing the police while keeping his body between the man and the family. "You're done," he said sharply. The man tried to push past him again, but David held firm, his grip iron strong. The shouting drew neighbors' attention. A porch light flicked on across the street. The drunk man cursed, pounding the doorframe as David finally shoved him back and slammed the door shut, locking it. The sound of sirens pierced the night minutes later, though it felt like hours. The man was still outside, yelling incoherently, pacing like a storm ready to strike. When the flashing red and blue lights washed over the house, David exhaled for the first time. Officers rushed up the path, and David opened the door cautiously, explaining everything in a steady voice while Emma hid the twins behind him. The police restrained the man as he shouted slurred threats, his fury now mixed with helplessness. "You'll regret this! She's mine!" he screamed as they forced him into the back of the cruiser. Emma's knees gave out. She collapsed onto the floor, sobbing into her hands. The house fell silent again, but not the same kind of silence as before. It was heavy, broken, trembling. David knelt beside her, his hand gently resting on her shoulder. "It's over," he whispered, his voice low and certain. "You're safe now." Emma lifted her tear-streaked face, her eyes wide with disbelief. "No one ever stood up for me before," she said softly, almost to herself. Her voice cracked under the weight of those words. David reached up and brushed a tear from her cheek with his thumb, his touch careful, steady, human. "You deserve to be protected," he said, the sincerity in his tone wrapping around her like a promise. She tried to speak but couldn't. Her body trembled as the years of fear seemed to pour out through her tears. The twins ran into her arms crying, "Mama, it's okay. Uncle David's here." And she held them tightly, sobbing harder now, her voice breaking with gratitude and exhaustion. David sat beside them quietly, the adrenaline slowly draining from his veins, watching the small family cling together in the center of his living room. Outside, the police car drove away, the sound fading into the night. Rain began to fall again, gentle this time, tapping softly against the windows. Emma leaned her head against David's shoulder, still crying, but something in her breathing changed. It slowed, steadied, as if her body finally believed she was safe. David looked down at her and whispered again, "You're safe now." The words carrying more than comfort. They carried truth. For the first time, Emma allowed herself to believe it. The house, though shaken, felt like a fortress again, not because of its walls, but because someone inside it had chosen to stand, to protect, to care. And as the children fell asleep in their mother's arms, David eyed there beside them, silent but steadfast, knowing that the ghosts of her past had finally been pushed back into the night. The days that followed were gentler, like the world itself was taking a deep breath after the storm. Emma began to find her rhythm again, her body stronger, her laughter returning in small, cautious bursts that slowly became real. The house that had once been a refuge from pain now buzzed with life. Children running down the hallway, the smell of breakfast on Sunday mornings, the sound of Leo's piano practice mixing with Lily and Lucy's endless giggles. David often caught himself watching from the kitchen doorway, a quiet smile tugging at his lips as he saw how easily the three children had become inseparable. They shared everything: crayons, secrets, scraped knees, and bedtime stories. It was as though they had always belonged together, bound not by blood, but by something deeper, something unspoken. Emma started working part-time at the local library, her first job in years, and every morning she left the house with a sense of purpose that made her glow. David would tease her lightly, "You'll be running the place by next month," and she'd laugh, shaking her head, though deep down she enjoyed the way he believed in her. In return, she helped him with Leo, homework, school lunches, even the occasional father-son disagreement that she could soften with just a few words. Their partnership was effortless, built on mutual care, on quiet understanding. Evenings became their favorite time. After dinner, the children would play in the backyard while David and Emma sat on the porch, sipping tea and watching as fireflies blinked like stars come down to visit. The air between them often filled with easy conversation, sometimes about their days, sometimes about nothing at all. There were long silences too, but not uncomfortable ones. They were filled with the kind of peace that only comes when two people no longer need to pretend. One night, the twins were chasing Leo around the yard, their laughter rising like music against the cool summer air. Emma leaned on the railing, her face soft in the moonlight. David stood beside her, his hands tucked into his pockets, quietly taking in the sight of the children tumbling across the grass. "They're happy," he murmured. Emma nodded, her voice low but steady. "You saved us, David." but you also gave us a family." Her words lingered in the air, tender and raw. David turned toward her, his breath catching slightly. He hadn't realized how deeply those words would hit until they did. Their eyes met, and for a long, suspended moment, the world seemed to still. There was no need for more words. The gratitude, the affection, the quiet ache of shared healing, all of it shimmered between them like something fragile and sacred. Emma's eyes glistened, reflecting the soft porch light. David reached for her hand, hesitant at first, then firm when she didn't pull away. Their fingers intertwined naturally, like it had been meant to happen all along. From that night on, something unspoken began to bloom between them. It wasn't rushed or dramatic. It was quiet, pure, and patient. Small gestures spoke louder than declarations. David waiting up for her after late shifts, Emma making his coffee just the way he liked it, the two of them exchanging knowing smiles across the breakfast table when the kids made a mess. Every act of care was a seed, and love began to grow silently in the spaces between their days. Sometimes, when she was washing dishes, Emma would glance out the window and see David playing with the children, his laughter deep and warm, his patience endless. It made her heart ache in the sweetest way. She had once thought love was loud, full of promises, shouted over storms, but now she saw it could be gentle, steady, and safe. It was in how he looked at her when she wasn't aware, in how he spoke softly when the twins woke from nightmares, in how he never asked her to forget her past, but helped her live beyond it. For David, love came like dawn, slow and inevitable. He found himself drawn to Emma not out of rescue or pity, but out of admiration. He saw her strength in the way she rebuilt herself, her grace in every small act of kindness. Her presence brought a calm he hadn't known he'd been missing. Nights after the children had gone to bed, they would sit by the window, sharing quiet talks that stretched into the early hours. Sometimes she'd tell him stories from her childhood, moments of light tucked between years of pain, and he'd listen with a tenderness that made her feel seen in ways she never had before. Months passed, and the house grew warmer in every sense. The walls once filled with echoes of loneliness now carried laughter, the table once set for two now crowded with life. The change wasn't sudden. It was like watching spring return after a long winter. Emma would often catch herself smiling for no reason, realizing that peace didn't feel foreign anymore. She had found not just safety, but belonging. One evening, as the sky turned gold and the children played in the fading light, David stood beside her again, just as he had that night months before. He looked at her, his eyes filled with the same quiet admiration that had never needed words. Emma met his gaze, her heart steady this time. There was no fear, no hesitation, only understanding. The world around them was simple in that moment. Children laughing, crickets humming, and two hearts that had found their way home. When David finally spoke, his voice was gentle, almost a whisper. "I didn't save you, Emma. You saved yourself. I just opened the door." She smiled softly, a tear slipping down her cheek, and without thinking, she leaned her head against his shoulder. He didn't move, didn't speak. He simply stayed, letting the quiet of their shared life wrap around them both. In that stillness, surrounded by the laughter of the children and the glow of the setting sun, love, soft, pure, and unspoken, became the air they breathed. A full year had passed since the night Emma had leaned her head on David's shoulder beneath the fading light. And in that span of months, their world had quietly bloomed into something beautiful, steady, and whole. The house had changed. There were new pictures on the walls, laughter echoing in every corner, and little handprints smudged along the hallway that no one had the heart to clean. The once simple backyard had become the heart of their home, filled with flowers the children had helped plant, patches of color bursting like small miracles in the soil. And it was here, beneath the golden breath of an early summer sunset, that David and Emma stood together, surrounded by family, neighbors, and friends, their hands clasped tightly as the soft rustle of the evening breeze carried the sound of joy. Emma wore a simple cream dress that swayed gently around her ankles, her hair curled loosely, glowing in the amber light. David stood before her in a white shirt and grey vest, a faint tremor in his smile as he looked at her, not with surprise, but with the quiet awe of a man who had already loved her long before this day. Leo stood proudly beside him, straight-backed, holding a small ring box with both hands, while Lily and Lucy danced barefoot on the grass, scattering petals from their baskets. The air smelled of roses and hope, and every moment felt tender, almost sacred. The ceremony was small, humble, and filled with warmth. When the time came to exchange vows, David's voice trembled slightly. "You and the girls walked into my life when I didn't know I needed saving," he said softly, his eyes never leaving hers. "You showed me that family isn't about what we lose, but what we choose to build. I promise to keep choosing you, all of you, every day." Emma's eyes shimmered with tears as she replied, her tone calm but full of love. "You gave us a home when we had nothing, David. You taught me what safety feels like and what love really means. You are my second chance, my peace, and my forever." As they slipped the rings onto each other's fingers, the children couldn't contain their excitement. Lily squealed, Lucy clapped, and Leo grinned so wide that the guests laughed through their own tears. The twins ran forward, tossing flowers into the air, their laughter pure and bright as sunlight. In that instant, time seemed to pause. The petals hung in the air, the wind stilled, and the world felt right again. Emma bent down to her daughters, her voice tender and trembling. "See, my loves," she whispered, brushing their hair back gently. "Not all men hurt, some heal." The girls looked up at her with wide eyes, smiling through their innocence, as if they already understood. David stepped forward, and without a second's hesitation, he wrapped his arms around all three children. They fit perfectly against him, Leo at his side, the twins between them, giggling uncontrollably as he lifted them slightly off the ground. He laughed through the tightness in his chest, blinking back tears that burned with joy instead of pain. "Now we have a real daddy!" the twins shouted in perfect unison, their voices ringing like music across the yard. David's throat tightened as he looked down at their bright, trusting faces. He could barely speak, his voice breaking as he whispered, "No, my angels, I have a real family now." Applause rippled through the small crowd, but David barely heard it. All he could see was Emma's smile through her tears, Leo's proud little grin, and the twins' flower-streaked hair. The golden light washed over them, soft and forgiving, as if even the sky itself was blessing the moment. When the officiant finally declared them husband and wife, the children erupted in cheers, and Emma leaned forward, her hands on David's cheeks, kissing him gently, slowly, as if sealing every promise they had ever made in silence. The evening flowed into laughter and music. The backyard glowed with strings of fairy lights, and plates of homemade food filled the long wooden table. Leo strummed his small guitar, his tune uneven but heartfelt, while the twins twirled barefoot in their new dresses, their giggles rising like wind chimes. Emma watched them with tears in her eyes, her hand resting over David's. "They've never been this happy," she whispered. David turned to her, his gaze soft. "Neither have I." She smiled, the glow of the lanterns reflecting in her eyes. "It's strange," she said, "how something broken can still become something beautiful." He squeezed her hand gently. "Maybe it's the broken things that know best how to hold love together." Later, when the guests had gone and the children were curled up in a sleepy pile on the couch, David and Emma stepped outside one last time. The air was cool, filled with the sound of crickets and the faint rustle of the trees. The sky stretched wide and golden, fading slowly into the blues of evening. They stood hand in hand beneath the same stars that had once watched over their loneliest nights. We did it, Emma whispered softly. We really made it. David looked at her, the corner of his mouth lifting. We didn't just make it, he said, brushing a strand of hair from her face. We became it. Family, love, everything. She leaned into him, her head against his chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat, a sound that once meant comfort, now meant home. The world around them seemed to exhale, peaceful and whole. Inside, Leo mumbled in his sleep, the twins' soft laughter echoing faintly as they dreamed. David kissed the top of Emma's head and whispered into her hair, "Thank you for knocking on my door." She smiled against him, her voice warm and full. "Thank you for opening it." A story of pain turned into love, of strangers turned into family, of hearts that dared to trust again and found healing, not in perfection, but in the simple, steady grace of being loved.